Coyote Oldman there. And you were tuned to 90.3 WZBC in Newton. And hey, join me Thursday for the umpteenth WZBC Powwow, where I present all music related to Native Americans and Native American-inspired music, folk, rock, traditional, country, new age, spoken word, and we'll hear from folks who come back from the continuing protests at Plymouth. And the show will run from noon till midnight. So please tell your friends and colleagues all about it. And this is Victor Robert Venskus. And it is now time for Expanding Awareness, on which I most often present live interviews, either regarding some aspect of the paranormal. I may feature aspects of holistic health, and from time to time we cover progressive ideas and animal rights and such. And back with us from last week, we have Andrew Cameron Bailey and Connie Baxter Marlowe, and they are authors and filmmakers, and they present their ideas on conscious living and the interconnectedness of nature of the universe with a synthesis of Indigenous cosmology, quantum science, and Eastern and Western mysticism through their game-changing book called The Trust Frequency, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm, and the companion film In Search of the Future, What Do the Wise Ones Know?, which features indigenous elders, Western scientists, and futurists from Africa, the U.S., and Mexico. And they do have a current film screenplay project called 50 Years, Freedom and Friendship at Plymouth Plantation. And it brings honor to the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Pokanotic, I knew I was going to say that word wrong, Wampanoag Indians for their role in the evolution of democracy in the American mind and spirit. And we'll be taking phone calls that we weren't able to do last week. So this is largely why I'm having you folks back. And so, good morning.
Good morning, Victor. We're happy to be back.
Okay. Hey, Victor. Honored to be on the show again. Thank you, man.
All right. Thank you as well. All right. For the benefit of those who did not hear our previous broadcasts, what do you mean about freedom and friendship at Plymouth and honoring the Mayflower Pilgrims? Because for many, they have negative views of that event. So why don't you enlighten us?
All right. So that is precisely what we're addressing, Victor. There are just egregious, I think is the word, misbeliefs, misinformation, misunderstandings about that specific time in history. What has happened? Well, let's put it this way. First off, there was over half a century of a really positive, unbroken relationship between the Mayflower people and the Pokanoket Indians. So that's a historic fact. What has happened subsequently is that lots of other things have happened in other places involving other people, other incidents, other geographical locations, which have now been, I think the word is collapsed. In other words, if something happened hundreds of miles away, 100 years later, people are actually saying and believing that these incidents happened at Plymouth between the period of 1620 and 1675. That is simply not true, not historically true. And part of the research of this project of mine has been to go into the history and go as deep as it is possible to go 400 years after the fact and to see what is true and what is not. Now, that's from the written record of Europeans who wrote journals mostly of their adventures and their observations. And so that obviously is different from the oral history that has been passed down through the indigenous people over these countless generations. And it's a real challenge to penetrate to what is true, but all we have are those original sources. And the fact is, Victor, that it was a positive relationship. These ideas of smallpox infected blankets, these ideas of slaughtering Indians and then sitting down to a Thanksgiving feast with the survivors, all of this kind of stuff is just not true. And when looked at carefully and rationally, that's the word, they simply, these things fall apart.
So where does that idea come from? And why? I mean, was there an effort to discredit the natives, a very conscious thing, or do you understand me?
Yeah, Victor, this story has been out of balance since the beginning because at first it was always glorifying the Pilgrims and for what they did, what they brought, the Mayflower Compact, the elements of democracy, and their vision for humanity basically was glorified, and the Indian was left out of the story. And our work for the past 30 years has been to bring the Indian to the table as an equal with what they have brought to humanity and what they have yet to bring to humanity in what they understand about the nature of the universe, their cosmology, their essence of their way of life. They call it their way of life. It's not a religion, it's a way of life. I've spent 30 years with Native people, visionary elders, and on various reservations, etc., and have many, many, many good friends, Native friends. And so what the story was out of balance. So it's a pendulum swinging, okay? And it reflects the consciousness of the people who are telling it. It reflects the consciousness of humanity, basically, because we're an evolving consciousness, okay? And so it's just really important to recognize that all of humanity is an evolving consciousness. We're all in this together. And it doesn't matter what color skin we have, what race we come from, what culture we come from, we're all part of one humanity, one consciousness. So this story, interestingly enough, which is a very important story because it's the founding origin story of America, which in America is the evolutionary step upward in human consciousness. It doesn't look like it right now, but in fact it is, and it's up to us to take it to that level. So this is a very important story. And so the pendulum was out of balance. The story was out of balance. The Indian showed up with Squanto, teaching the Pilgrims how to plant Indian corn, and then there was the Harvest Festival of 1621 that's now known as the first Thanksgiving. So that just stereotyped the Indian and put them into a pigeonhole that they want out of. They want people to know they are human. They have a magnificent culture. They have a magnificent heart. They have something to bring to the party. That's what needs to get on the table. And so as the consciousness started to evolve and say, wait a minute, hold on, these Pilgrims were cool, and they definitely were. I mean, we've been to England. We've tracked them all the way from Cambridge, England, to Scrooby, England, to Leiden, Holland, to find out just who these people were and what their intent was. And what we found is an impeccable, inspired group of people who made huge steps for humanity in the movement from monarchy to democracy, in the movement of self-determination, of the direct relationship to the divine, which is very Native American. Native American way of life is based on your direct connection to the Creator. And so we discovered that these people these Pilgrims were, in fact, impeccable people, okay? And what happened when they came here, they met Massasoit, who was an extraordinary leader, okay? And we've got proof of this, documented proof of this from Hobomok, who, when he heard that Massasoit was dying, he said, my sachem, oh, there is none like thee. What you handle with love, accomplishes so much more. That's not a direct quote, but it shows that Hobomok saw Massasoit as unique in the native way, because the natives were all at war with each other. They, as I said, it's all about the evolution of consciousness, and the natives have been in an evolutionary process as well. They have this amazing cosmology, but their behaviors through the millennia have been just like ours. Okay, they've been fighting, they've been at war, they've taken slaves, they've hoarded and taken taxes and built empires and done it all. It's the human condition. So meanwhile, what has happened with revisionist history, as sort of the white guilt started taking over as far as what ultimately happened to the native people after King Philip's War, when the native people basically disappeared from the history books, the white guilt started taking over, and the native victim stance started playing its role, because the more of a victim the native is, the more money they can get from the government. So the government's actually perpetuated this victim-perpetrator position, which is not an honorable position for the native people. When I'm with native people, I don't treat them like victims. I don't see them as victims, because it's all in their own cosmology. Everything has a purpose. Every action has a purpose, and as Andrew says, behavior has consequences. So everything, this whole mixture of events that have led us to today, has had a higher purpose, and that is to bring us to today, where we get to choose to come together and do something together. But meanwhile, this story with revisionist history, with the native people, and with Howard Zinn himself, the great author of The People's History of America, or the United States, just doesn't do his homework and doesn't state the facts. Somehow, people are getting to say the most outrageous things that are untrue, that aren't founded in fact, and a gullible society takes it in and says it's true because somebody said it. And we've got to, supposedly we're an educated society, and that's one of the reasons for education, is so that you actually can make your own choices, and you're actually educated so you can see the truth of what has gone on. But truth it depends on perspective, In one level, King Philip started a war that broke the treaty, and ultimately led to the demise of his people, all native people. Okay, so on one side he is a bad guy. On one side he is a hero. He stood up for the native people, and he took out all these settlers in their fields, and all these moms and dads and kids, and he got all the Indians up and got them fighting for their land. So he's a hero. So it depends, You can look at any military situation. One person's a hero out from one perspective. He's a demon from the other perspective. So it's a complex situation. But meanwhile, this revisionist history has been spreading stuff and is in the college curriculums, is in our school systems. So little white kids and little Indian kids don't know what to believe, and shares out tweeting, the Pilgrims brought, I'm not celebrating Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims brought smallpox blankets to the Indians, which is a total absurdity, but 2 million people now think that the Pilgrims brought smallpox blankets, and many people have thought that before. But meanwhile, this swinging pendulum of demonizing the Pilgrims in order to glorify the Indian, it's just an absurdity that needs to stop. And what we're doing is we're taking it to a higher level that brings honor to both the Pilgrim and the Indian for the synthesis that occurred during that 54 years of true friendship, true living together, and exchanging ideas and ways of being and thinking, but also the whole Indian-white relationship. There were plenty of good relationships. There was plenty of intermingling, not just this 54 years, but here in this little burg of Plymouth Colony, but all over the East Coast, there was amazing interrelationships. and King Philip's War actually became a family feud, because it wasn't demarcated between the Pilgrims, the whites and the Indians. Plenty of Indians were on the white side. They loved how they were treated in Plymouth. Okay, the Indians were and there's an Indian right now, an author, who says, the Plymouth paradigm, if it had only existed and if it only continued, we'd all be better off. So, meanwhile, what needs to come is the value of the Indian today, who they are, what they have to bring to the party. They're amazing human beings with amazing hearts, amazing spirits, and amazing connection to what we call a conscious, loving universe. And what we've discerned from living with these people, we've discerned that we are all connected to a conscious, loving universe. An animal comes in your path to teach you a lesson because you are loved by this conscious, loving universe. This is the core of the native knowing, okay? And they have an extraordinary understanding of the human heart, of all the ways of creation and interconnectedness. I was good friends with Wallace Blackout for 15 years, and he had two-way conversations with rocks, okay? And I know white people have two-way conversations with rocks, So we live in a world that's so much more beautiful than we can fathom. And we're not going to be able to move into that paradigm, which we call the trust frequency, which is our book. And we give tools for getting there, and it's bringing that indigenous cosmology and quantum science and Eastern Western mysticism together to show people how to get there so we can move to another level where this oneness and this interconnectedness and this abundance lives. So that's what we're doing with our project, taking this whole story to another level where who did what to whom doesn't even matter. It's okay, what are we going to do now with the Indian heart, the white heart, the yellow heart, the black heart, all of humanity coming together and bringing peace on earth and heaven on earth.
All right, let's talk about some of the things that might be confusing to people. Why is tobacco a sacred thing?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I'm going to hand this one to Connie.
Well, that's a very specific thing to the native people. It is and it isn't, because to me, what the native people know and what they do is a symbol of all of the true nature of the universe. Okay, so this tobacco being a sacred, it's the grandfather of the sacred herbs. Okay, there's tobacco, there's sage, there's sweetgrass, and there's cedar. Okay, so those four have properties that help humanity. Okay, if we understood that, see, just that one thing, if we understood. And this is, the smudging that goes on in churches. They swing the thing, the incense thing, or whatever. I don't go to church, but this smudging idea. See, we have an energy field, and it collects negative energy, and also to objects. So the native people take those herbs that have these properties, these magical properties, that we consider magical, because we take them into our that's what the smudging, before you go into any ceremony, you smudge all of your tools of healing or whatever, and any art project you're doing to get the negative energy out of yourself and out of your project. Your basket or anything. It's not specific to native people. They just have this understanding. So the tobacco is something special. Okay, it's something connected to the divine, to the Creator. It's something that is a very honoring element, that the Creator is connected to this conscious, loving universe somehow. And I've actually talked to somebody who is in a tobacco store, who owned a tobacco store, a white person, and he said, yes, he could feel the energies working with this tobacco. I'm not a person that can feel this stuff, but there are plenty of humans, native and other, that can can feel these energies. So that's
And of course, there were no accelerants, and there were no chemicals, and all this crap that's in tobacco now.
yeah. See, there's that, and also it's interesting. Alcohol. See, the native people in like Mexico use alcoholic substances to take them to other realities. Okay? And I've spent a lot of time with the Mayans, a lot of time with the Tarahumara and the Huichol and many folks down in Mexico, and this is the essence of what they use to take them to other worlds, and we actually call alcohol spirits.
That's
okay?
right. I was always curious about that.
Yeah, so what I think the difference is, Victor, I think it's a frequency thing. I think it actually, see, we're in a lower frequency right now. So
Hey, speak for yourself.
yeah, okay. Tobacco poisons us. Spirits make us drunk and don't do their thing. We get the negative aspects of these things because we're basically operating in a lower frequency, and so this raising to a higher frequency, the laws are different in the different frequencies, and that's what we're bringing in our book, that as we raise our frequency, the actual laws of the universe are different. And so the native people have that connection into that other frequency, and they use ritual to do that. They use their sweat lodges, their other ceremonies to access these other states of being.
Now, also, they're very connected with the influence of ancestors. What can you say about that role in native cultures?
Well, it's very interesting, Victor, that you should ask that, because I've been hanging around with these guys for a long time, and they're always talking about the ancestors. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? My ancestors are dead and gone. From my perspective, they're in the ground. They were cool. But they're always talking about the ancestors and the role of the ancestors in our lives today, that they're guiding us, that you can connect with them, that they're there. And what I've come to understand in my own life is that my ancestors are driving everything I do. I'm a Mayflower descendant. Why am I sitting here talking to you right now? Why am I putting my life, totally committing my life to bringing this story forward? Because my ancestors dreamed a dream for humanity, and they came together with the native people and did something important that's now being trashed, okay? So my ancestors are like, you've got a job to do, girl. And then I have some other ancestors, the Baxters of Maine, who my great-great-grandfather left money to the city of Boston to build a pantheon to honor these founding principles and ideals of the early settlers of New England. And what he didn't know was the role of the native people, so I'm bringing that to the party. But James Finney Baxter, who's one of the top historians of early New England, and he was mayor of Portland, Maine, many times, had this vision, but he wasn't even a Mayflower descendant. But I've got all these guys driving everything I do. So this ancestor thing, from my personal experience, is very real. And if you talk to a Native American, you'll find out their whole understanding and their connection to them. And also, there's a line in Amistad, the movie, when I don't know if you've seen it, but
I have actually, yes.
Yeah, Cinque, the black man who was a free man who they were trying to say was a slave, he got his way to John Quincy Adams, who was going to the Supreme Court of the United States to plead his case. And John Quincy Adams said to Cinque, okay, Cinque, I'm going to the top court in the land to plead your case. What are you going to do? And Cinque said, I am going to invoke the spirit of my ancestors because it is for this day that they ever existed at all. Okay? So that gave me that's a huge platform to stand on with just the whole evolution of consciousness, our responsibility today to our ancestors, to the people who've brought us this far. What are we going to do next?
Okay, And also, the word medicine always comes up with Native cultures, like bear medicine. What would be meant by that?
Well, from what I understand is, it's a term for their energy. What the bear. See, they live in a magical world. Okay, to them, a bear is not just a furry thing that eats berries and shits in the woods, right?
Right.
To them, the bear is this phenomenon, has certain characteristics, becomes their spirit animal, becomes their guide, becomes their protector. I mean, it's a whole nother magical world, Victor, that I have glimpsed. I saw it 30 years ago in my first association, and I'm like, man, if these guys can do this, we can do it. This is missing in the paradigm. We've got a scientific paradigm that has us in a stupid little box where we're separate from our hearts, we're separate from the rest of humanity, we're separate from this amazing creation that these Indians have this connection to. So, this has been my role in life, is to bring these Native people to the table. And if you go on YouTube, we've got several channels on YouTube. One is Fly W Eagles, one is Peace Healing Americas, one is the Trust Frequency, one is the Institute with 2 N's. We have so much footage of these people speaking of this way of life, because I'm like, hey, listen, humanity, this is a way of life. This is a knowing. This is a connection to the magic of all that is, to the love that drives all of creation. And we can all do this thing. If we just open our hearts, open our minds. Wallace Black Elk used to say, we're prisoners of our minds. And that's why we're bringing 10 assumptions for a new paradigm, to free our minds from this ridiculous mechanistic paradigm that we've been catapulted into by Newton and Descartes and that crowd.
Now, what concept is there of what God is?
All right, this is Andrew. I'm going to come back on here, just so you know I'm actually still in the room. So from our perspective, our book, we describe God, that word God, which the native people who the Mayflower Pilgrims encountered had a name for, and they agreed with each other that they were talking about the same thing. They called it Khitan, K-I-E-T-A-N, I believe. And they had that same concept. And the Mayflower Pilgrims clearly they'd come from the, sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which tends to have this picture of God as sort of a human form, right, an anthropomorphic deity. We talk about a completely different thing, because our personal understanding, is that the thing referred to as God is not a separate person at all. It is, in fact, the universe. It is, in fact, all that is. There is nothing but God. God consists entirely of love with a capital L, and I use that term in the quantum physics sense, as that which creates and sustains everything that is, which is a very Vedic concept if you go back to ancient India. So the native people, I believe, by never having separated themselves, never having divided things into boxes, it was really Descartes who said, if I can't see it, if I can't measure it, it doesn't exist. If it doesn't reveal itself to my senses, it doesn't exist, and now we're in a situation where an awful lot of people, that's the way they feel. Can't see it, therefore it doesn't exist. Wait a minute. I can't see electricity. I guess I can feel it. Stick my finger in the light socket and I feel that, don't I? So there are ways of detecting electricity. But you know what I mean? There's so much of the unknown or the invisible or the undetectable that we take for granted. Now, quantum physics has been alerting us to the fact of one major aspect is quantum entanglement, the fact that everything in the universe is intimately connected to everything else in real permanent time, and every single thing influences and affects everything else. These are attributes to me of what others might call God.
Yeah, I want to remind you that you're listening to Expanding Awareness, and this is Victor Robert Venskis. And I want to let folks know to join me, welcome you to join me for the umpteenth WZBC annual powwow, and this coming Thursday. And I'll be presenting all music related to Native American themes and Native American inspired music. I'm going to play you some rock, some folk, some traditional chants, some new age and spoken word and country music. And we'll also be talking to folks who have come back from the continuing demonstrations at Plymouth. And also Andrew and Connie will be joining me at some point after 3 to 11 or so. So listen for that. And I'm going to try and open up the phone lines here at 617-552-4686. 617-552-4686 for your questions, comments, and opinions. Perhaps complaints regarding what you have heard so far for Connie and Andrew. And they are authors of the Trust Frequency, 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm. And there will be a film called In Search of the Future. And let's take this call, see what happens.
Frequency, 10 assumptions.
Oh, okay. You're going to have to turn your computer down.
Called In Search of the Future.
And unfortunately, we are on a delay.
Okay.
Okay.
Take this call, see what happens.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah. Please just turn your computer off.
You're going to have to turn your computer down.
Call again. And
Hello?
Yes, hello. You're on the air. Okay. I'm going to have to drop that one. Because of delay, we get that kind of feedback and also the delay. Okay. Now, as the natives were so visionary and they were able to predict what would happen to the native peoples, as we might interpret them as so evolved, why could they not succeed in their fight with the Europeans?
All right, that Victor, is a huge question. The history of humanity has been one of repeated migrations. My ancestors, for example, I believe some of them were actually Vikings. I was born on, not on Turtle Island, but another little island over on the other side of the Atlantic called England. So I'm an Englishman. So I'm profoundly interested in this subject. My country, my little island there, was invaded by wave upon wave upon wave of migrating people. The Romans came in AD 45. The Vikings came, the Angles, the Saxons, the Norman invasion of 1066. And yes, there were invasions, and oftentimes they were brutal. And what happened is this little island of England simply didn't have, the folks there at the time simply did not have what it took to resist the invading forces. That, I believe, is what happened in North America. The sheer numbers and the advanced technology of Europe was irresistible. What happened horrifically and tragically down south with the Spanish was just ultimately tragic for the native people. And in North America, it was in fact very different. The French experience was a lot more positive, a great deal more positive for the native people. And the initial contact, the initial relationships with the English was very positive. In Jamestown, by 1620, the Jamestown colony had built schools for the Indians. They had completely integrated the Indians. They were their friends. The same thing happened in Plymouth. So this is what we're working on pointing out, is the fact that there were examples of true harmony between these very disparate cultures. It wasn't like the Mayflower arrived as an invading army and stormed ashore, guns blazing, smallpox-infected blankets handed out in all directions. That kind of vision is simply not it at all. However, what happened later in Jamestown in 1622, you have the Jamestown Massacre, where the natives on a signal rose up and slaughtered about, I believe it was 427 English settlers without any warning whatsoever. It shocked and horrified the world. In Plymouth, it lasted a lot longer. It lasted until 1675, when the natives declared war on the English, and King Philip's War, so-called, or Metacom's Rebellion, kicked in, and we had another horrific bloodbath. It was really, truly tragic. And what had happened, of course, by 1675 is something like 20 or 25,000 additional English had come across the Atlantic, settled around Boston, and with the resulting pressures for land, with cattle coming in and eating in natives' cornfields, and on and on. It was not a military invasion, it was a migration. It's actually called the Great Migration in English history, where a large number of English headed in this direction. But from another perspective, you can look at it as an invasion, and it was irresistible for a number of reasons. One of those reasons, of course, was the European diseases that really did decimate an awful lot of the native population.
Now, was this intentional, or did they, they didn't have the immune systems, right?
Well, this again is the field of epidemiology, and to attempt to scientifically study something that occurred hundreds and hundreds of years ago from a truly scientific, rational basis, that's challenging. But just this last week, a very interesting thing has unfolded. My personal research this last several months has been to try to discover what the epidemic was that took the people out, the Patuxet people specifically. Patuxet is the Indian name of what is now known as Plymouth, Massachusetts. The Patuxet people had been wiped out by an epidemic. Now, a lot of people right now believe that they were wiped out because the Mayflower brought smallpox-infected blankets. That is absolute nonsense, and for obvious reasons. The Mayflower arrived at the end of 1620. The epidemic occurred between 1616 and 1618. Secondly, the epidemic turns out not to have been smallpox. So the smallpox blanket thing is just nonsense. It was discussed later, hundreds of years later, in other places, and that's my point about collapsing these events that happened or may have happened elsewhere, out west in the 1800s, up during the French and Indian War in the mid-1700s. It did not happen in Plymouth, and it did not happen intentionally. Now, what has just unfolded in England is they were excavating for an extension of the London Underground, the subway system, and they found a mass grave, and it was from the late 1300s, and they were victims of the plague. And this plague had swept across Europe, and this is interesting, this plague swept across Europe from China way, way, way back in the 1300s. Okay, it eliminated 6 out of 10 Londoners died in that plague. Did the Chinese do that intentionally to the English? I don't think so. And finally, that same plague, and what's interesting, it wasn't bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is transmitted by rats and fleas. And I was totally puzzled as to how rats and fleas I can see how they could come across the ocean on a ship. Let's say a French fur trader would come across, and there'd be rats and there'd be fleas. However, a disease to spread that way would take a long time, and this disease hit hard and it hit fast, and it took out a very large proportion of the native peoples of New England, who, as you say, did not have resistance. Neither did the English. 6 out of 10 Londoners died of that plague. Now, here's the difference, and it's something that a clue I was looking for. It was not bubonic plague, it was pneumonic plague. Pneumonic means transmitted by air, by breath. It was airborne. Oh, my God, there you go. That's it. So an airborne plague crossing the Atlantic on a ship, delivered inadvertently, I am certain, by Europeans, seems to have arrived on our side of the Atlantic, infected the native people, and then spread incredibly rapidly through the native people. And I've also been looking at the mechanism. So the disease wasn't smallpox, and if it was indeed pneumonic plague, airborne plague, What nobody seems to realize is that there was a horrific war going on at that precise time between the years of 1615 and 1619. The natives from the north had come south in war canoes, in an armada of war canoes. And this is a historic fact that is not known. If you're at Plymouth, you just don't get this information. If you're in Boston, you do not get this information. But you go up to Maine, you go up to Nova Scotia, and here's the story of what happened. The Massachusetts Indians, not the Wampanoags, not the Poconokeets, but the Massachusetts, sent up a war party to help the Penobscots in their conflict with the natives to the north over the fur trade with the French, trading for furs. What happened is one of the great European influences was bringing in this whole trade thing. And there were enormous wars that occurred over competition for the fur trade, involving the Iroquois, the Mohawk, the Micmac, the so-called Tarratines, the Penobscots. And in this particular conflict, the Massachusetts, there was at the time too, this is also not known, there was a Massachusetts Federation that was the most powerful native alliance in New England at the time. They went up north to help their Penobscot friends and were quite successful and returned bringing with them some captives, some women and children. And the natives to the north came down with a vengeance each summer. They were the raider people who had a history of coming down at harvest time and raiding for corn and raiding for young ladies. We can all relate to that if we're men. And returning, and so they knew the coast intimately. They had these high-speed birch bark canoes, unlike the local natives around Plymouth who had big hollowed-out log waterborne transport, which were slow and sluggish, and you could not use them in a military sense. The natives who came down from the north arrived in force and proceeded to decimate the coastal tribes. This is not known. Nobody talks about this. And if they were at the same time, Victor, carrying airborne plague, because firstly, as with Ebola right now, we know Ebola is an exceedingly dangerous illness in Africa, and it can spread incredibly easily. And in this world where we have Boeing 747s transporting thousands of people all over the world all the time, a disease can spread like wildfire. In the context of that war, I believe this disease was spread and took the people out. And if that was the case, then it would have taken out the warriors themselves, wouldn't it? Go and look at their culture, and indeed, they lost 80 to 90% of their people at that same time. So this is key information. It was not done intentionally. It had nothing to do with smallpox. Blankets were not involved. The Pilgrims were innocent of, so far, every one of the accusations I have heard leveled against the Pilgrims. So that's the results of my research.
So, Victor, you asked a question, and that was why the Indian couldn't, if they were so wise, why they couldn't protect themselves and prevail over the incoming shift. And what I want to bring is a higher perspective, and that is that, and I don't know if you've ever read The Return of the Bird Tribes. But Ken Carey is a very visionary guy, and what he brought forth was a higher perspective, and that was that it was intended in the overall picture of the evolving of humanity for the European and the Indian to come together, that the Indian was to be the teacher of the European, to bring that magic in that knowing that I've talked about that we're trying to bring to the table now.
That wisdom.
That wisdom, so that we could meld all our wisdom and move forward as a species. That was the intent, but the Indian had left the path of peace 2,500 years before the coming of the white man. The Indian was doing exactly the same thing, was operating on the level of amassing wealth, of building cities, Powhatan was an emperor down in Jamestown. Massasoit, They collected taxes. They did all this stuff. They warred with each other. They took slaves. They did the whole thing. If you go into the history, you'll see that humanity was all on the same level, and the Indian was on that level. They have this amazing interconnectedness with all of creation. They have this amazing heart, this amazing spirit, and to bring to the party, but they also, in their behavior, were behaving on the same level as the rest of us. So on that level, on that frequency, it was war, and they lost the war. Okay, they perpetrated plenty of genocide on the white people. In fact, if you see the statistics, it was about equal. How many massacres were perpetrated by the Indians on the whites, and how many were perpetrated by the whites onto the Indians? So what we have to really totally realize is that every race, every culture has visionaries. Everyone on the planet can connect to the unified field and to the understanding of the nature of the universe, the future, the past. You know, everybody has the mystic, the oracle, the whoever, you know, in all cultures. And so what the challenge is now is for us to move into that, move out of the warring, greed-based behaviors that have driven humanity forever, because we're moving. The Earth is moving into a higher frequency. We're moving into a higher frequency. It's called an evolutionary leap in consciousness, and that's what our work is about, okay? And then that is, we just want to dispel this whole concept of the noble savage on this pedestal. We've put them on a pedestal. We need to let them come off the pedestal and be human, acknowledge their history of war, of all the stuff that they were doing to each other, so that we can come together and the white man can move out of his guilt and out of his shame, and we can say, hey, you know what? We're brothers and sisters, and we have been all through the ages.
All right, let's talk about another subject, the relationships between men and women within the native cultures. Weren't women somewhat marginalized?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because if we go look at the Iroquois, so-called, the Iroquois Confederation, we know very clearly that there is essentially a council of grandmothers, the clan mothers, who have a lot of power over the way things work in that society, in that federation. It was very intelligently put in place a very long time ago, long before the coming of the white man. In fact, the warring tribes of the Iroquois came together. It was the peacemaker. It was a Huron who came to them and convinced them that to unite was a good thing. And part of what emerged from that was a way of being a federation of separate, previously warring nations, and they used the women as wisdom keepers to really keep things under control. This was an extraordinarily unique and wonderful manifestation of really what democracy could be. And as I think most people know, the Iroquois Constitution influenced the United States Constitution. Franklin actually integrated some of that thinking into what ended up becoming the U.S. Constitution. It's not necessarily the case everywhere, however. Women, the role of women, the power of women seems to have varied from culture to culture and place to place. If you read the early reports, now these of course were written by English people mostly, and they didn't necessarily understand what they saw. We have to understand that. That applies to all of the written history. But they did their best, and their observation was this: the Indian women did all the work. So it was tough. The men did not work. The men made statements to the English people who were talking to the English men and said that would be beneath our dignity. We would not plant. We would not cook. We would not do the various. That's women's work. It's beneath the dignity of men. Men are warriors. So there is that too. And it's come to us both ways. And my suspicion is that, as with everywhere else on the planet, different ethnic groups, different organizations of humans have different structures. So I think it varies, Victor.
Okay. Peyote.
And in Plymouth, actually, the women had a lot more power than in other. The English women in Plymouth had a lot more power than the Puritan women in Boston, etc. They were definitely participated in the businesses and in the community in a powerful way.
Let's talk about the use of peyote within some of the native cultures.
All right. Victor, our focus is entirely on New England, and it was at that time no peyote whatsoever, to the best of my knowledge, in those cultures. I found no evidence of that.
What about the Hopis? Let's go beyond New England. Maybe Connie can talk to that, the use of peyote in ritual.
Well, the Native American Church today. I mean, I have sat in Utah outside of a teepee within which a Native American church ceremony was an all-night event was ongoing. So peyote and a number of other substances have been endemic throughout indigenous cultures. There are always these plant helpers who can take us to the spirit world, whether we're talking about ayahuasca. And, in our era, Victor, LSD, for example, was an extraordinarily transformative substance that did get abused somewhat and got thoroughly shut down by, of course, the larger society because it was so transformative in a society that had no desire to transform. So, it just seems to be not necessarily as relevant this very week because this is the week of Thanksgiving, this is the week of the National Day of Mourning. And I would like to say something about the National Day of Mourning, and that is that while I have ultimate respect for the native suffering, the heartbreaking events that have unfolded throughout the country to the native people, I would just ask those who speak at the National Day of Mourning to make sure that what they say is true, is historically accurate. Because the first time I went to the National Day of Mourning, I was shocked because I didn't know much at the time, but I knew that what I was hearing was not true. And this is the problem. Victor, just yesterday I discovered a blog by a very influential African-American political commentator specifically on the Pilgrims. And the stuff that he had to say was so horribly inaccurate and incorrect, just to the point of absurdity, including the smallpox blankets, the entire story. Virtually every nonsensical thing I've ever heard was very beautifully expressed in this statement that he made, a very long thing, maybe 10 pages, a thesis that was extremely well written. The guy could get a PhD for doing it, and it was not historically accurate, horribly not so. He clearly had an agenda, a very, very powerful anti-white, anti-English, anti-American agenda. Understandably, I tend to side with the underdog. I tend to have a great preference for hanging out with my African-American brothers and sisters, sometimes to, more than the whites. I mean, the influences in my life have been, I grew up in Africa. I don't know if you knew that. I grew up in South Africa, and my influences have been very much African. And since I came over here, they've been very much Native American and Middle Eastern. I did a lot of Sufi work, and, all of these different cultural treasures that come to us from the different ethnic groups they're precisely that. They are treasures. And by spreading hatred, we lose the treasures of humanity. It's tragic. And I really ask that we don't do this. I respect anybody who has pain and anger to express about something that really did happen. I'm fine with that. But if it's not true, please, let's not go there. It's just not a good idea because people believe what they are told, they believe what they hear, and it spreads untruth, misbelief, anger, shame, and blame in places where it simply does not belong. And that's the situation with this Thanksgiving. Revisionist history. We find ourselves having to, revise revisionist history.
Mm-hmm.
I'm perfectly fine with revising history if the history's wrong. But if history is not wrong and we're revising it for, shall we say, propaganda or politically charged purposes, oh man, it's a tough subject. It's been a bit of it's been a hard path for me this last 6 months researching this stuff, quite honestly.
But one thing I wanted to finish that you had asked about the concept of God and the relationship with God, the Creator. What I have come across is a couple of quotes that show a similarity between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. And here's a quote that Edward Winslow says. He says. He's referring to as a conversation he had with a native chief after he had saved the life of Massasoit. He says, these and like considerations moved not only every good man privately into examination with his own estate between God and his conscience, and so to humiliation before him, but also more solemnly to humble ourselves together before the Lord by fasting and prayer. Okay? That's Edward Winslow in Good News from New England, explaining their position, their relationship with God to Combatant, who is the one who said, who you call God, we call Khitan. Okay? So the quote that I want to quote, though, is from a book called Indian Medicine Power by Brad Steiger. And this quote says, the personal revelatory experience received during the vision quest, when the native goes out on the hill to ask for a vision, becomes the fundamental guiding force for any traditional Native American Indians medicine power. The dogma of tribal rituals and the religious expressions of others become secondary to the guidance one receives from one's personal visions. Okay? So I'm sorry I kind of, stumbled a bit. But if people can really see that the alignment, the spiritual alignment of the Indian and the Pilgrim, okay, this direct connection with your conscience to the divine, this is the key for all of humanity right now, that we connect to our conscience, we connect to our hearts, and we connect to the divine, and we act accordingly. So...
Okay, I need to say that this is WCBC Newton. Now, you have so many websites and addresses and stuff. What one connects them all?
Well,
what's the best address to get in touch with you folks?
thetrustfrequency.net is our master website. And we have many YouTube channels that I talked about. And the first 50 years, we have a website called first50years.us. First50years.us. That'll take you to our blog for the First 50 Years project. And thetrustfrequency.net will take you to an overall website that you can access everything else from.
Okay. No, go ahead.
As well.
All right. Now, I lost my train of thought here. How will you be spending Thursday?
Well, we're in Boulder. We got called out here to Colorado to live with my dad, who's in the end of life process. Otherwise, we'd be in Plymouth. We were looking forward to being in Plymouth for the second or third time. We've spent many Thanksgivings in Plymouth, but we'll be with friends here in Boulder. And we're also speaking in Boulder at the Highland Institute City Club on the good news about the first Thanksgiving, bringing the fact that this Harvest Festival, it's now called the First Thanksgiving, was really just one piece of a whole process of bringing this idea of democracy, freedom of conscience, of consent of the governed, all that became America actually started there in the 1620 with the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrim Massasoit Treaty of 1621, and this harvest festival now known as the first Thanksgiving. It's not an isolated incident that we need to go and pick apart. Well, was it a Thanksgiving or wasn't it? And Indians have always had Thanksgivings, and so have all the Dutch. When everybody, because the Pilgrims were in Holland before they were in Plymouth. That everybody has Thanksgiving feasts. So to single this one out as the first Thanksgiving, people are objecting to. So let's just see it for what it is, and that's one event in a whole process of 54 years of coming together of English and Indians, and what came out of that synthesis is America today, and what are we going to do with it?
Now, are there others writing in a similar vein to you, Andrea, and Connie regarding the history of the natives in Plymouth and elsewhere?
The answer to that is yes. They're mostly academic historians.
Uh-huh.
All right. So for example, 2 weeks ago attended a weekend NEH conference at Plymouth Plantation. The facility there that presents this sort of living history. And 16 of the top scholars on the subject were present, and I had the honor and privilege of being invited. Actually, Connie and I both did. She had to come to her 94-year-old dad here in Colorado, and I got to attend this amazing conference with the 16 top scholars in the field. And yes, indeed, of course, those people are publishing, they're writing books, and in exploring this history, which is in fact very useful, because the great thing about Plymouth Plantation is it's not only Pilgrim and English oriented, it's very balanced between Wampanoag, Native American, and English. So there were Native scholars there were Wampanoag individuals in the audience, and it was an extremely useful interchange. I got to really sit there and listen to what was being said, and also, of course, to track it for what was not being said, because I have my personal, I have some ideas that I'm not seeing out there in the realm of history.
Okay, well, thank you very much for expanding our awareness regarding the first 50 years, freedom and friendship at Plymouth. And I want to remind folks that these shows are archived for 2 weeks. If you dial up wzbc.org, hit archive and the date and time. Now, as we go over, you would hit once again 11 o'clock in the morning. And I want to encourage everybody to spread the word and let folks know about expanding awareness. And once again, join me for the annual WZBC Powwow. I've been presenting this probably for 30 years now, and on which I do present all Native American and or Native American inspired music. We play some rock, folk, traditional, new age, spoken word, and country music. And this happens from noon till midnight, and on occasion we even go later than that. Okay, thank you once again, Connie and Andrew.